Eleanor had buried the ring on a morning in March, 5 years after her husband's death. She'd wrapped it carefully in silk, placed it in a small box made of cedar wood, and buried it beneath the ancient oak tree that stood at the edge of her property. The gold band, worn smooth by 30 years of marriage, had felt like a weight around her finger after Daniel died, a constant reminder of what she'd lost and would never have again. At 52 years old, with grey threading through her dark hair and lines etched deep around her eyes, Eleanor had decided that her life as a married woman was behind her. She had become and would remain a widow. That was her identity now, her purpose, the role she understood and could fulfill with dignity. The ranch had been Daniel's dream. He'd built it from nothing in the early days when the territory was still wild and untamed. Eleanor had come to him as a bride at 22, unused to the hardships of frontier life, but willing to learn. She'd learned to break horses and mend fences. She'd learned to shoot straight and ride hard. She'd learned to birth calves in the middle of the night and to negotiate with cattle buyers who tried to cheat her. She'd learned to be a rancher's wife, and she'd been good at it. Daniel had told her so every day for 3 decades. When Daniel had died, Eleanor had grieved in the deep, ancient way that came from losing someone who'd been the center of your universe. But she'd also discovered something unexpected. She liked running the ranch. She was good at making decisions. She was capable of managing finances, hiring hands, dealing with difficult situations that arose in the unpredictable life of ranching. In her grief, she'd found a kind of freedom. She'd never expected to have these abilities. Daniel had always made the major decisions, and Eleanor had supported them. Now she discovered that she could make them herself, and often her decisions were better than Daniel's had been. The years after Daniel's death had been lonely, but also purposeful. Eleanor had thrown herself into the work, had expanded the herd, had improved the breeding program. She'd taken a struggling operation and made it profitable. She'd earned the respect of the ranching community, men who'd initially doubted that a woman could run a successful operation. They'd come to understand that Eleanor Wade was one of the finest ranchers in the territory, and she'd come to understand that she didn't need a man to feel whole. She had the land, the work, and the knowledge that she was capable of taking care of herself. That, she'd decided, was enough. Then James Hawthorne had ridden into her life on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer. He came to her ranch looking for work. A stranger from New Mexico, with a reputation for honest dealing and excellent horsemanship. Eleanor hired him because her operation had grown large enough that she needed more help. She also hired him because there was something about him that didn't feel like a threat to the life she'd built. He was perhaps 10 years younger than her, maybe 45, with kind eyes and a way of moving that suggested competence without arrogance. James was quiet. He did his work well and didn't complain. He didn't try to assert authority or question Eleanor's decisions, but he also didn't seem to pity her or treat her as if she were fragile or in need of protection. He treated her as a colleague, respectfully but as an equal, and Eleanor found that she appreciated this immensely. Over the months that followed, as summer turned to fall, they developed a rhythm. They'd work together on various tasks, riding the property to check on the herd, mending fences, preparing for the coming winter. They'd talk about ranch management and strategy. They'd eat meals together, and Eleanor would notice that James had a gentle sense of humor and a keen mind. She didn't realize she was falling in love with him until one afternoon when he was injured while breaking a horse. A young stallion had thrown him, and James had landed badly, fracturing his arm. Eleanor had driven him to town to see the doctor, had waited while the doctor set the bone and created a cast, had brought him back to the ranch and insisted he rest while the bone healed. And in that time, watching him try to manage tasks one-handed, helping him with things he couldn't do for himself, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. She felt needed in a way she hadn't felt since Daniel's death. But more than that, she felt a fondness for this man that went beyond gratitude or admiration. She felt love, and the realization terrified her. When James recovered, Eleanor half expected him to leave. The injury had sidelined him for 6 weeks, and he had no real obligation to stay. Instead, he asked her for a raise and said he wanted to continue working on her ranch. Eleanor granted the raise, and they fell back into their rhythm, but everything felt different now. Eleanor was hyper-aware of his presence, of the way he moved, the sound of his voice. She was careful to maintain appropriate distance, to treat him professionally, to not give him any indication of what she felt. She was a widow, she reminded herself. Her time for romance had passed. This was foolish and inappropriate. One afternoon in November, as they were rounding up strays, James asked her why she never mentioned her first husband. Eleanor replied that it was in the past, that she preferred to focus on the present. James said he understood, but that from his perspective, Eleanor was a remarkable woman who'd clearly been loved deeply at some point, and it was hard to imagine her keeping that experience locked away. Eleanor didn't answer, just turned her horse and rode ahead, disturbed by how much that comment had unsettled her. The winter came hard that year. Snow piled up, and temperatures dropped to levels that made outdoor work dangerous. Eleanor and James spent more time in the bunkhouse, working on equipment repairs and planning for spring. One evening in late December, sitting by the fire with hot coffee between them, James asked Eleanor about the oak tree that stood at the edge of her property. He said he'd noticed her looking at it often, especially when she thought no one was watching. He asked if it had significance. Eleanor froze. No one knew about the ring. She'd told no one. How could James have suspected? She set down her coffee carefully and considered lying. But she found she was tired of pretending, tired of maintaining the walls she'd built around her grief. So she told him. She told him about burying the ring, about deciding that her life as a wife was over, about choosing to find purpose in the work and the land instead of in love or partnership. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her if she was truly happy being alone. Eleanor said she was content. James said there was a difference between content and happy, between acceptance and fulfillment. He said that from what he could see, Eleanor was a woman who had the capacity for great love and great joy, and it seemed a waste to bury that capacity along with a ring. Eleanor felt anger rising in her. She said that he didn't understand, that the pain of losing someone you loved deeply was something that changed you permanently. She said that opening herself up to that kind of love again felt like a betrayal of what she'd shared with Daniel. She said she'd made peace with being alone, and she didn't need anyone to convince her that peace wasn't enough. James nodded as if he understood, and he didn't argue. But he also didn't back away. Instead, over the following months, he simply continued being present in her life. He was patient and kind and never pushy. He showed her that he respected her decisions, while also demonstrating through his actions that he cared about her. He helped her in ways that weren't required of a hired hand. He remembered things she'd mentioned in passing, and later did thoughtful things based on those memories. He made her laugh when she'd forgotten how to laugh, and slowly, imperceptibly, he became essential to her life. It was James who suggested that they build a second house on the property, a larger one, where they could both live more comfortably. Eleanor said she was fine in her current house. James said he wasn't suggesting they share the house, just that it made economic sense to build a better structure, and perhaps he could help with the construction. Eleanor agreed, thinking it was simply a practical decision. But as they built that house through the spring and summer, Eleanor realized that she was building it because she wanted James to stay. She was building it because the thought of him leaving had become unbearable. One evening in August, as the new house was nearly complete, James invited Eleanor to walk with him to the oak tree. Eleanor's heart was pounding as they approached it. She knew somehow what was happening, and she was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. They stood beneath the ancient branches, and James told her that he loved her. He said he understood that she'd been hurt, that she'd built walls to protect herself, that she needed time. But he said he was willing to wait, willing to prove that love didn't have to mean losing yourself. He said he wasn't asking her to forget Daniel or the life they'd shared. He was asking her to consider building something new with him, something different but equally valuable. Then he asked her if she was willing to dig up the ring and consider wearing a wedding band again. Not the same ring that belonged to her past with Daniel, but a new ring marking a new chapter, a new kind of love that could coexist with the memory of the old one. Eleanor's hands shook as she knelt and began digging beneath the oak tree. James helped, using a spade while she worked with her hands, pushing away the earth until she found the small cedar box. She opened it with trembling fingers and looked at the gold band inside. It was beautiful still, worn smooth by 3 decades of wear. But it didn't feel right anymore. She'd changed. Her life had changed. And perhaps, she thought, change wasn't betrayal. Perhaps it was growth. She looked at James and said yes. Yes, she would marry him. Yes, she would dig up the ring and bury it properly, finally releasing it to the past where it belonged. Yes, she would build a new life, a different life, one that honored both who she'd been and who she'd become. They were married 3 months later in the church in town. Eleanor wore a dress of soft blue instead of the traditional white. The community came to celebrate with her, and she could see in their faces that they understood what this meant. The widow was choosing to live again. She was choosing not just acceptance, but joy. They built a life together on the ranch, and Eleanor discovered that love the second time around was different, but no less precious than it had been the first time.